To feel or not to feel? That is the question. Welcome, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about feelings, bodily sensations, and should we connect to them? Should we allow ourselves to feel certain things? Sometimes it's good to be disconnected, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's good to feel, and sometimes it's unresourceful. What I want to be talking about today is my experience of being associated or connected to our feelings and emotions and dissociated, quote unquote, to be detached from the standard feelings and emotions that we can, will, or should have. Now, within coaching and therapy and hypnotherapy, a lot of the times we work with clients who are stuck in unresolved emotional states. They might be feeling frustrated, they might be feeling depressed, they might be feeling angry. These in themselves are emotional states. And you do find people who actually struggle with that whole emotional spectrum, people who disconnect, and we can disconnect in a multitude of ways. Some people it's distraction, some people it's thinking about other things, some people just shut off their feelings altogether. So, if you find this interesting, do put in the comments and chat. So, for those of you who are watching live online, I'll try and interact as best as possible if you put notes in the comments. But let's just jump in to talk about okay, so what is association and disassociation? How am I going to define these terms? And then let's talk about the pros and cons within coaching and therapy. So, if I'm looking at association, so association is to be connected to, I'm going to call it a state of being. So it could be a specific emotion. Now, some people struggle with emotions. I learned a few years ago what anxiety was like. Now, some of you might be like, what do you mean you only learned a couple of years ago? So, women are normally a lot better at describing their emotions than men are. So, if I was to define emotion, an emotion is a cluster of internal sensations, a cluster of internal bodily feelings. Hey, Anna, it's not a Zoom practice, it's more of a communication conversation, but I look forward to seeing you at the next practice. So for me, it's around how we connect to our internal environment. So, for example, if somebody is really connected to an emotion, they'll get certain feelings. So, I had a moment a couple of years ago where my wife says, "Oh, you're anxious." And anxious for me is I've got a certain set of feelings in my stomach. I've got this certain hesitation. Normally, my shoulders are tighter. No worries, Anna. So, this is a consideration regarding how you actually associate. So, as much as people say we've got certain feelings, when it comes down to how associated we are, it's how connected to those feelings or emotional structures that we have going on inside ourselves. So, for example, some men can have lots of feelings, but they don't necessarily know how to put a label on them as a specific emotion. So, it's how connected we are to these emotional or physiological signals within our body. Now, so you can also have excitement. People talk about having butterflies in their stomach. These are all different ways that we describe what's going on inside us. And culturally, society has given these things labels. What's excitement look like? What does anger look like? What does anxiety look like? So, what I'm talking about is these certain internal emotional states. And some of these don't have words, but we can still associate to a certain feeling. Have you ever had a feeling and you know something's not right? You know you don't feel quite right, but you can't give it a label. You can't give it a description. You just can't put words on it. This is why I love the metaphors of movement work, because for people with that kind of problem, it helps to gain clarity and insight as to what's going on inside us. So, associate. Now, we can all associate to different contexts and situations. We can associate and connect to the experience of other people. Have you ever been in a situation where you're watching a great film, watching Avatar, no, not Avatar, Last Airbender at the moment, and there are some really emotional bits. You actually can feel the emotions of the other person. So it could be said that you are associated to what they're feeling. You're getting similar physiological signals within your body that they are potentially having. Now, we as humans have mirror neurons. This is way of how we learn, how we look at body language, and how we can get a sense of what's going on with other people. So, by looking at these things, we can associate to others' emotions. We can associate to our own emotions, be it excitement, joy, pleasure, happiness. despair, grief, anger. We can associate and connect to those things. But also, a lot of people dissociate. For me personally, I'm very good at associating to others' emotions, but I'm very good at disassociating from my own. So, why could that be useful? Why is it good to not be connected and in touch with your emotions? Well, sometimes it can be really painful. If somebody is constantly experiencing a painful situation in their life, sometimes to actually be able to cut that off, some people have gone through horrendous things, so they actually dissociate the feelings around it so that they can actually go through life. They lose the emotional component so they can look at it subjectively and they don't get sucked into it. But sometimes it can actually be dangerous, or not dangerous is an extreme. It can be quite problematic if we are too connected to these emotional states of being. We all know the person who's frustrated or grumpy or depressed, and they're constantly going into this state of depression, anxiety, anger. That some people might call that their emotional home, where they go to a lot. So by associating regularly to a certain feeling, a certain state of being, that can be quite challenging and problematic. So as coaches, therapists, and change workers, we can look at ways of, okay, how can I maybe separate this person from those emotions? And you can do that from a variety of different ways. In NLP, you might use perceptual positions, maybe get them to go in third position, which essentially is a disassociated position from their current state of being. Now, you could argue that they're associated to a disconnected position. Okay. So we can get people to dissociate that way. Sometimes in hypnotherapy, you might get people to fly up, create distance between them and their current experience. We might use fractionation in a whole host of ways to help disconnect and shake up that connection to that emotional stimulus. But on the flip side, in certain NLP or hypnotic processes, you can actually get people to reassociate to maybe more useful states of being. You can get people to be more excited, more happy, more curious. And by doing these things, you help to open up different parts of the person's neurology. So, if let's just say you've got somebody who thinks it's always going to be the same way, nothing's going to change, this in a stuck state of being that nothing's going to be different. Let's just imagine we could associate them to a place where maybe they're a bit more curious, a little bit more wondering, a little bit more open to possibilities. If we get them to associate to that and then bring them back to their problem, they might start to think about things in a different way. So, when is association useful? So, association, from my perspective, it can be useful when we're actually living life, when we're enjoying experiences. How often do we get distracted in our phones, in our technology, to actually be in the moment with people? Association, like being present, some might say, for some emotional states, not all emotional states are present focused, that can allow us to have a more fulfilled life. If we live in happiness, you may have seen one or two people, they're pretty rare, who live in joy. They've developed that place to come from a very joyful state of being. They're seeing, they're hearing, they're feeling the whole world around them in a very joyful way. That's when it can be useful. It can also be useful if we wanna, in hypnosis, for example, you can do something called deep trance identification, where essentially you get someone to associate to somebody else. It could be a genius within their field, it could be Einstein. And what you're doing is you're getting their brain or their neurology to think about how Einstein might think, which is obviously very different to how you think. So by associating somebody to somebody else in that context, you can potentially get them to think differently because the individual will think differently to them. When is associating a challenge? When we're stuck into our problems, stuck into our situations, it can keep us locked into those frames of reference. Now, similarly, if we look at dissociation, the ability to distance ourselves from an emotional context, when can that be useful? It can be useful when we want to get a broader perspective of things. One of the challenges when we're emotionally involved in something in the moment, we don't see everything because we're literally in it most of the time. Whereas a dissociation can serve to allow people to get a broader perspective on things, take things as they are, look at things a bit more objectively, as opposed to our subjective emotional experience, which can give great insights. This can be really useful when looking at relational and relationship dynamics with people and couples. For example, you can associate to your partner. How does your partner think and feel and act possibly in that situation? Stepping into their shoes, we call that in everyday language. Or we can take a step back and look at the general context. Because sometimes we look at people arguing. I mean, we might have seen them out and about in the shops, and sometimes we can see like, oh my God, this is crazy. Like, what are they arguing about? It seems so petty. But it seems so petty for us because we're just an outsider seeing just a surface level interaction. So that could be quite useful for us. But a lot of times, dissociation can actually serve to limit people's ability to live life, to address their problems and address their issues. Now, sometimes if someone's gone through a tremendous event, I'm not going to want them to associate to that. I might use IEMT, metaphors of movement, or another process to work with that because I don't want to associate someone to a traumatic event. I don't want to re traumatize them again. Why would I do that? Makes no sense. And I actually had a very interesting experience. So when I was on my first NLP training, we talked about collapsing anchors. Now, for those of you who don't know what collapsing anchors is, you can do a multitude of different ways, but as a very basic idea, what you do is you say, think of a happy place or a good memory. And what you'll do is you'll see what you see, hear what you hear, feel what you feel. Essentially, you get sensory engagement. And this is how you associate people more to context. You get them to think more vividly regarding their sensory experience. That helps us be connected to our senses. So you think good feeling, and then you press down, essentially. You create what's called an anchor. Basically, a reminder if I touch you here, you feel this way. Okay. Now, you can intensify that using hypnosis or NLP or a variety of other techniques. Now, what we were doing is we were getting a positive state and a negative state. So think about a feeling that was negative for you, and you press that anchor. Okay, so the person like, ooh, my problem state. So you got happy state, positive, negative state, happy state, negative state. And what we did is essentially what you do is you bring a person to think of good thing, you bring in negative thing, and what you do is you see there's a bit of a conflict between the two. Then you let go of the negative thing, and then you bring them back to the positive thing. Essentially, what we're doing is we're mapping across a positive resource into a negative state. But I saw this guy, and he created a mess with one of the participants. And what he did is he's like, think of the negative state. And then he said, okay, well, how are you feeling in that situation? Getting them to connect kinesthetically. What do you see in that situation, giving them a bigger visual representation? What do you hear? So what you're doing is they're really getting the person to see, feel, experience, almost relive vividly that experience. And it can be really quite traumatic. And he tried to put this positive resource, but he'd got them so much into the negative, he couldn't get them out of the positive. There are certain processes within NLP where I know Tony Robbins does a process where basically you connect with extreme visceral pain and not having achieved an outcome. And I mean, it can be quite useful in some instances. I mean, not my preference. I don't want to put someone through that agony. But we know pain motivates people to do things, and pleasure does. Normally, pain creates more of a response. So we could connect somebody to something really painful, really thing to make them move, but it's a pretty brutal way of doing it. I don't know if you've ever had the experience in a corporate environment, but if a manager comes up to you or says, "Okay, look, we're gonna have to look at this. We might have to let you go, and we're looking to potentially fire you," that brings up a whole host of negative emotions. Now, for some people, they need that sort of kick up the arse to do stuff. Essentially, we're associating that person as a manager into the possibility of them not having a job, not having that security, not having that stability, which could be quite painful. And what we do see is there are some people who have those conversations and they turn around their whole career because of those moments. A lot of really famous people within the personal development space, they've all got a good story, right? But a lot of them really crashed and burned. And that association to how painful that was really spurred them on. So this is a consideration I'm going to offer you if you're a coach, therapist, or change worker watching this is when do you want to connect somebody? When do you want to associate them? And to do that, we want to connect them to their sensory experience, what they see, hear, feel, taste, and touch. We can intensify that. We can ask submodalities, so the descriptions. So if it's visual, like, are there colors? Is it black and white? Is it a movie? Is it an image? Describe what you see. We can really get them to be in it. We can get them to stand in it and live it. When is that valuable for a client? And similarly, when is it valuable to get them to dissociate, to just maybe take a step back, look at it more objectively, move it out into the distance, because that can give different insight and different perspective. Now, when clients come in to a session, they will have a variety of different structures that are keeping them stuck in the position they're in. It could be if they're too associated, too disassociated. It could be elements of time. Are they thinking about the future too much, the past too much, the present too much? For example, are they generalizing everything or dealing so much with the details? We see this often in procrastination. There's so many things to do, they get overwhelmed. So they need to look at more of the bigger picture. But if we're looking specifically at association and dissociation, where is this person? Are they too sensorily engaged in the problem that they're in? Do we need to work to disconnect them from that to create distance, to create more choice and options? Because for me, I ultimately believe that if we can create more choice and options, it doesn't mean that life's going to be better and easier. There might be a challenge to go through, but it's about, okay, right now they don't have choice. So that's what I'm looking to invite clients to experience. Or if they're too disassociated, if they're too abstract, how do we get them to associate? We see a lot of people, some of the emotional change work that people do, and a lot of like Eastern philosophy, they're like sit with the emotion because emotions only last so long. And sometimes it can be useful to sit with something. Think of an unpleasant emotion for a moment, if you're up for exploring this. Just pick an unpleasant emotion and just remember that what that is. Don't pick a crazy mental one, just one that's realistic. And just, okay, so I'm going to use an area of life where I procrastinate and worry about all those different things. If I just sit there for a moment, feel that, and just hold on to focusing to holding on to that feeling, like procrastination, for me at least, and for you, whatever it is. After a time, it passes. Now, that might be a minute, that might be 2 minutes, it might be longer. So, this is a methodology whereby you do associate your emotion to actually deal with it. Because from my perspective, a lot of emotions are signals from our body, our unconscious, to say, look, there's something to be aware of. There's something going on with you physically, emotionally, some might say spiritually. What's going on inside me? What do I need to look at? Is there something there? And sometimes it's a case of just sitting with that and being with that, which a lot of people will actively disassociate. They'll play games, they'll watch videos, they'll procrastinate, they'll avoid those things in order to not have to deal with them. So sometimes we do need to guide clients to associate to some of these things so they can actually be dealt with. If a client is looking to change an emotional state of being that they're having challenge with, if they're not able to associate to it, it'll be very difficult to start to create that change. I had a client who had a phobia of spiders, and we did lots of different things, but he had a very specific phobia of one specific spider in Australia. We did a lot of different stuff. He got to the stage where he could touch house spiders and things like that. He was all well and good, but when he went to Australia, obviously it's a whole different thing. And for him, it was very difficult for him to associate to that context because it's scary, right? He was initially scared of watching YouTube videos. Now, if you think a video is a relative natural dissociation, and he was scared, but he watched the video, and he desensitized himself to the video. Then when he was in Australia, he still really, really had problems because he had these things going around in his head. So if you struggle to get them into experiencing that emotional context, this is where you could struggle to create some of that kinesthetic or emotional change. So this is a few thoughts on association, dissociation. Sometimes it's worth considering, well, let's actually focus on the enjoying what we do and how can we associate more in life? How can we be more here? How can we be more present? How can we engage more? And sometimes it is good to disconnect, to take that step, to take that time to reflect on what's going on, because it can give us a broader perspective outside of our own experience. And sometimes it's even good to associate how other people might think and feel and act, because that could add resources too. So it's all an experiment. It's all good fun. So consideration. Do I need to associate more, disassociate more, or do something a little bit different that's in between? That's your daily dose with Dal. If you like this, do give it a heart, do give it a like. And as always, keep on taking steps, and I'll catch you at the next one.